Okay, class, in this video, we're going to cover three topics. Selinux, which is chapter 5 in the second book. We are going to cover uh, controlling the boot process in chapter 10 and managing the network security, which is chapter 11, all in the second book. Now, in these labs, there's not really a lot for you to do. It's more informational than anything else. So I'm just going to go over these three chapters in this one video. The first topic is Selinux. In the past, what we covered was security permissions, where we assigned rights to certain files, to certain users. But Selinux is a slightly different, takes it in a slightly different angle. Basically, what they're going to do is it's going to secure files and directories from processes. So basically, if you have two services, let's say a DNS server and a web server running on the same server, what if someone hacks the DNS process? And at that point, they'd be able to access the system and do something negative to your system or malicious to your system. What Selinux does is it prevents processes from accessing files they're not supposed to access. So the DNS server would be allowed to access the DNS files that are under the var directory, um, and the web server would only be allowed to access the files for the web service. So it kind of controls what a process can access. Security permissions that we're used to protects files from users. Selinux protects files from processes. So I'm going to show you a couple of commands to configure Selinux. So if I want to just look at my current settings for Selinux, I don't know why I can't type. I'm just going to reopen the terminal. By the way, I'm on server 1. You could be on server 2 or server 1 to do this lab. And I could say git enforce. And currently it's showing me that Selinux is being enforced. If I want, I could do set enforce. And if I hit enter, it's going to show me what I have to do. I either do enforcing or permissive. If I do enforcing, it's going to block a service or a process from accessing files that it shouldn't have access to. If I do permissive, it won't block, but it will make an entry in my log files. So I could set it to set enforce 0, and it's now set to permissive. Now if I reboot this machine, it's going to go back to the default setting, which was enforcive. So if I want to change it permanently, so every time I reboot it's set to permissive, I can add it etc sysconfig Selinux. Edit this file, and I could set, currently it's enforcing, I could set it to permissive or set it to disable. A lot of network admins, when something new comes out, and Selinux isn't really new, but it's difficult to learn. So a lot of people will change this to permissive and weaken the new security system. It's it's better to learn the new system and than to just actually disable it. So I see a lot of people actually doing permissive here, and they really shouldn't. If you're having multiple services on one server, you really need Selinux to protect the machine from being hacked and letting someone who hacks like the web server to infect all the services that are running on that machine. So this is just a little quick overview. When you read chapter 5, it's going to, the machine is acting really sluggish. It's not, when you read chapter 5, it's going to go over the context of the security permission, how to use Linux. A lot of times, if you try to set up two services and you get an error, something called the Selinux Troubleshooter will pop up here and show you the right command. So a lot of times, if you don't really know the context, you can still get by because that Selinux Troubleshooter, I don't know if it's installed by default. It's not installed by default, but you can install the SE Troubleshooter, and it helps you with the context. And right here it is. So if you install that, here it is. And basically, every time you get an alert when, let's just say you're having a web server and a database server working together, and the web server tries to access the database, you might get an alert and it's saying, if you approve this, here's the command that you run. It gives you the SE Linux command. So at that point, you can allow the web server to access the database on the same machine if that's your intent. So this is a nice little utility. I use it a lot, again, because when you look at the structure of the SE Linux commands, you'll see that it's kind of convoluted. So I highly recommend this utility. The next topic we're going to look at is controlling the boot process, which is chapter 10. And the first thing they cover in that chapter is password recovery. So I'm going to reboot this machine. If you've messed up your etc.fs tab and you need to fix it, this will be the process you would use as well to fix your fs tab. Say you had a typo when you're trying to mount a disk and you didn't test that ahead of time. So I moved my cursor so the timer stops. So basically I have two kernels to boot to, a rescue kernel and my normal kernel. And when you boot a kernel, there's some options you can add to the kernel line that tells you how to boot that kernel. So what I want to do is I want to break the normal boot process, which mounts the kernel in read-only mode. Actually, it mounts a small kernel first, and then while it's using that kernel to boot your normal kernel. So it mounts your normal kernel in read-only mode, and then later in the boot process, it will remount it in read-write. And we'll also do that with the file system. So you have to load your kernel first, and then it loads the file system. What we want to do is break it before it actually loads our file system. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose E to edit our kernel lines. Those two kernel entries, they're called stanzas. So I'm editing the stanza for our normal boot kernel. And you might have more kernels than this. If your machine did a kernel upgrade, you might have multiple kernels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go use my arrows. I'm going to go down to this Linux line. This Linux line, because it is so long, it's going to wrap around on a different line. So that's really one line. That Linux just wraps all the way around. It's showing me what kernel I want to mount, what the file system is, mounted in read-only initially, mount the swap memory, and then it's going to eventually remount the regular OS as read-write. So what we want to do is break that boot process by typing rd break. And it's going to wrap. So that little backslash lets you know that it's just one big long single line that got wrapped to the second line. So once I add that rd break at the end of that Linux line, I'm going to press Control X down here to go ahead and boot this. So now it's going to boot. So now basically I'm in the system in emergency mode. If I type the mount command, I can see that my operating system is now mounted to something called sysroot. So this was like a temporary file system that allowed me to get to this command prompt and to repair something on my OS. The book has it as a password recovery. So what I'm going to do is my operating system, which is mounted under dev, which is the partition is dev, mappers, real enterprise Linux, Red Hat enterprise Linux, root, is mounted to sysroot. In a production system, this will be mounted to slash. So right now, during the boot process, it mounted to sysroot. Once it's actually up and running, it'll remount it under slash, but right now it's mounted as read-only. When your system's up and running normally, this partition, it's actually an LVM volume, is mounted under slash as read-write. See that little read-only? So what we're going to do is mount sysroot, and I want to supply some options to the mount command. One of the options is read-write, and one of the options is remount. So basically, I want to mount this file system as read-write, so I can actually make changes to it. So right now, the root of my file system is where I'm currently at, which is this temporary file system that just allowed me to get up and running. I want to switch to my normal file system that I would use in a production system, which is now mounted under sysroot. So I want to do change root to sysroot. So now my system is going to think this is slash. It's going to think that this will be the top of the file system. I won't be able to go to the real file system. So now when I do a mount, it looks like I'm still in slash, but in actuality, I'm now in sysroot. And just like my normal file system when I'm up and booted normally, here's all my directories. So now I'm tricking my computer into thinking this is the top of my file system, which is really sysroot. So when I run a command, it's going to look for the commands in these directories, not in this root up here. It's going to use this new temporary root. So if I wanted to, I could do password I'm using our standard password. So basically, when I updated the password, it updated the password in this file, cat. Let's see. So right there, it updated this password, not the password of the real root file system, which actually didn't have a password. And one thing I want to point out, for security reasons, if someone can actually get to the computer and attach a keyboard to it and boot to that computer, they would be able to do this. So for security reasons, when you have a Linux server, what you need to do is not only secure it like you normally would with your firewall and things like that and security permissions, but you need to physically secure it. It needs to be in a locked server room so people can't get to the actual console. If they can get to the console, they can do this and they can change the root password to whatever they want. So anyone can do this if they can get to that console. So you need to make sure that that server is secure both physically and electronically with your firewall and things like that. So anyone can walk up to a Linux box, reboot the machine, press E, edit the kernel line, and at that point gain access to the full machine. So you need to be very careful with physical security. Some people had issues when they were doing the FS tab, and I used the same procedure to edit FS tab when they had typos. People, when they mounted things here, they would have typos, which I'm not on server 2, but if you had that problem, you can use the same process to fix your SCFS tab. So it's kind of a way to get into the system, control that boot process so you can get to a command prompt and fix something should something go wrong, or change a password in the case that we're doing right now. So once we're done with that, what we're going to do is we need to tell the system to go through and relabel um, the system for SELinux. So by creating this file, if that file exists at the root of the file system, which in our case is the folder under sysroot, if I create a blank file called .autorelabel and the system reboots, it knows to go through and relabel all the SELinux contexts. So I'm going to exit my change root. This is going to bring me back to my normal recovery root, my emergency mode root. Once I type exit again, it's going to log out and reboot the machine. And then the SELinux relabel will occur. So right now, it's saying it's going to go through and do the relabel. And that might take a few minutes. So I'm going to pause the computer. Okay, it's done doing the relabel. And so now it's going to clean up the labels on temp and then reboot. I'm going to pause it again. While this is still on my screen, you can kind of see some of the Selinux syntax right there. And you can see that it's extremely convoluted. System underscore U, object type, file system admin. So that's Selinux context right there. Okay, it's booting now. So that was one way to get into your system should your password be messed up or you don't know the password, or you want to go in and fix the file system or scan the file system for errors, things like that if your disk had some errors. And I'm going to pause the video for a minute and go to the next chapter. Okay, I'm going to sign in. And now I'm doing chapter 11. We're going to talk about the firewall. I don't have any graphic firewall utility installed right here, so I'm going to show you the command line. If you install that web console, then you actually can play around with the graphic utility. I'm just going to use a command prompt. I'm going to sign in as root, and I have this command, firewall d.cmd. I'm going to hit enter. Just firewall cmd. Firewall D is the daemon. Okay, so I have all these commands that I can use with Firewall D. The firewall that we actually use is something called IP tables. And IP tables, a lot of people found it very difficult to use. So they made this other utility that will configure IP tables. So if I do an IP tables, and there I can see the actual IP tables. So they made this new command, firewall-cmd, that will allow us to control IP tables in a more user-friendly way. So the first thing I want to talk about is my zones. And these are the zones I currently have: block, DMZ, drop, external, home, internal, libvirt. That's for virtualization if you're running some sort of KVM server, public, trusted, or work. So each of these firewalls have different firewall rules in place. So if you're on a public, if you're using the default public firewall profile or zone, then at that point your machine is going to have a very tight firewall, not allowing anything into that server. If you're in a trusted, that means most likely that virtual machine or that real machine is behind some sort of corporate firewall that's protecting it. So trusted and work is going to be more relaxed than um, the public zone. So I'm going to do firewall cmd get default zone. And all these commands are listed in the book. So I'm currently using the public zone, which is a really tight zone. Nothing can get into the server. So if you install a service, like right now we have yum info httpd. I can see that my web server is installed on this machine. If you don't have the web server installed, you can do yum-y install httpd and install the web server. It's already installed for me, so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to press cancel because I don't want to wait for um, that other repository. Okay, so I'm going to do get zones again, get default zones. So right now my default zone is public, and I can change it to whatever I want. I can set in any zone that I want. So that might not be your active zone. So maybe you change zones temporarily. So I can do git active zone. And it tells me currently that on my production interface, I'm using the public zone. For my virtual bridge, should I want to turn this into a KVM server, which is like a virtualization server to host virtual machines, it's using the libvirt zone. And we can change to anything that we want. We can set the default if you want. So if I wanted to set the default zone, I can say Firewall Cmd git zones. Sorry, it needs two. So I have all these zones that I can use, or I could create my own. So I'm just going to use one of theirs. So I could say firewall. I don't know why I can't type today. So I set my default zone to home. But if I look at my active zone, I can see it changed it right there and then. I'm going to do firewall CMD list all. And that's going to show me what currently is open. Guys, remember I was just talking about a web interface? That's the web interface that I was referring to. It's called Cockpit. And basically, I believe it uses port 9000 and it creates a web interface for you to configure this Linux server. I'm not going to go over that now. But right now I can see that for my current zone called home, that these services are allowed in. Cockpit, IPv6 client, MDNS, I don't know what that is, the Samba client, because remember we installed Samba, and the SSH service, because this machine is running the SSH service. And what I can do is, let's say I want to allow people to access my web server on this machine. I can do firewall CMD zone equals home, add service equals HTTP. Now, if I didn't put this permanent here, it would actually edit my firewall live, what's in memory. By saying permanent, I'm not editing the actual firewall, I'm actually editing the firewall config file. So I'm going to add this to my firewall config file. So next time I reboot or reload my firewall, that service will be available. So I'm going to hit permanent. And if I look at my current firewall, it's not added yet because this is going from memory. I just changed the config file. So I could do firewall cmd reload, and it's going to tell my machine to reload my firewall from the config file. If I do list all now, I can see that I'm allowing HTTPN. Before I didn't allow that. So if someone tried to get to this web server now, they'd actually be able to get to it. Now, these services, there are some predefined services that you could add. And I'm trying to, I believe it's list services. Let me just try that. That's showing you the services that are allowed currently through my firewall. Give me 1 second. Let me look up this command because I can't remember it. Okay, I figured it out. Firewall Cmd get services. So these are all the common pre-configured services. So if you wanted to add like Plex to this machine and you want to open up the firewall, you can just say firewall D and the command firewall cmd, name your zone and add that service because it's a well-known service. But let's say you're not dealing with a service that is well known, but you want to open it up for this machine. Say you downloaded something off the internet, not a very common service, but you want to allow people to access service. You can do firewall. This list right here is all the pre-configured services. So if it's not pre-configured, you could say zone equal home because we want to configure our home zone. We're going to do add port equals, let's say we have our web server listed on port 8080 TCP, not the default port 80 TCP. So we're having our web server listed on a non-default port. I want to make that permanent. And then I want to reload my firewall. Then I want to list my firewall. So now, instead of adding a predefined service, what you could do is, if you know the port and protocol, you could add it that way as well. They both accomplish the same thing, but this is just the predefined services that Red Hat has made for us versus port 8080 TCP. That's the one that I want. Or I could open it up and add a protocol and things like that. So at this point, if I reboot this machine, this port would be open and also this port would be open. So just a little bit of how to manage your firewall. Guys, if you look here, there's a bunch of tips on how to configure your firewall on Google. And give me 1 second, someone's texting me. Okay, so there's a lot of websites out there, and what I'm showing you right now is just the common things that you really want to do with your firewall. So it's showing you how to start the firewall, enable it. That's already done by default. It's already pre-installed on our box. It shows you how to list the zones, how to get the default zone, how to list the services, how to list open ports, how to add something to your firewall, how to restart. I didn't show you this method. I just showed you how to reload it without having to restart your firewall. So the little bit of stuff that I showed you, 9 times out of 10 is the things that you're going to be doing. You're going to be adding a service, either a predefined service, and if it's not predefined, you're going to be adding a port and protocol. And then at that point, you're going to reload. You might have to change your default zone because by default it's always set to public, so you might have to change it to a different zone that's predefined. Like in my case, what I did was home. You might set it to be work or something like that. Sorry, that's missing the. And these are the predefined zones. If your machine was sitting in a DMZ, demilitarized zone, and at that point, it's going to be fairly, your firewall is going to be fairly tight because that machine is going to be exposed to the internet. Um, Sometimes packets are rejected versus dropped, meaning that if someone tries to get to your web server, you'll reject that packet, meaning you're going to tell the person who's trying to connect to you that you're not allowed. Well, if you do that, what's going to happen is it'll let the client know that you exist and you're just not allowing them in. So they might come up with a new angle of attack. Instead of rejecting a packet, you could just drop the packet. So at that point, um, they won't know you're there because you're not going to respond to their request versus telling them they're not allowed. So that might trick the attacker into thinking you're not up and running. So drop might be better than a reject packet. So you have that firewall rule. You have external or home or internal. So you would choose whatever one that most fits your scenario. In our case, I'm just saying this is a home server. So I set my default to home. If you want to set your default to work or public or trusted, those are things you might do. You're definitely going to have to add services to your firewall to allow that traffic in. You don't really need to have to restart the firewall daemon. What you can do is just um, do a reload. That other site that I showed you, they were just having you restart the firewall daemon after you update your firewall. So you could do some. I just want to show you something else. IP tables, guys. I've used IP tables for years. I never had a problem with it. I'm not as familiar with firewall D versus IP tables because I'm just old school. So we just allowed HTTP in. So it's going to be represented here. Uh, it's taking forever to load this chain. I don't know why. The forward chain. But all Firewall D is really doing is configuring this IP tables in the background. That right there is for my virtual network should I set up some virtual machines for that libvirt firewall. So that's what sets that. So guys, this is the last chapter we're going to cover. This video in particular was just like a mishmash of a bunch of little topics. But this has been a kind of a strange class. We had a half in class, half remote instruction. I hope everyone got what they're supposed to out of this class. Um, it, I think using ACE-IT and me making these videos was the best case scenario. So what I would like you to do now is the last day of class is May 3rd, which is a Sunday. So I would like you to have all your labs done so I can review them by May 2nd. So once you're done with all your labs, you have everything done on your two machines, send me an email in D2L. Don't send it through regular email or don't send it through text because I'm trying to go through order because I have 5 classes right now, and I'm going through and grading everyone's labs. So it's going to take me a while. If you send it in another method, I might miss your um, grading your lab. So what I would like you to do is send me an email in D2L saying that you're all done. And when I get to it, I'm going to start a review that you've done all the labs and give you your final grade. Um, Everyone, have a good summer, and I will see you when I see you. Thank you.